Hello, everybody. My name is Solimar Salas. I am a VP of Content, Innovation, and Audience at the Museum of Latin American Art. We welcome you today, Wednesday, March 27th, 2024, to this edition of MOLAA Zoom Project. We have a conversation with Francesco Mariotti. Our curator-in-chief, Gabriela Urtiaga, will talk to the artist about his work. In this edition of MOLAA Zoom Project is part of our exhibition Arteônica Art, Science, and Technology in Latin America. That will be in MOLAA in September 2024. We thank the Foundation Earl B. Miller and California Humanities Arts Council for Long Beach and California Arts Council for their support of the educational programming at the Museum of Latin American Art. For the audience, we will have interpretation available. Please select your preferred language on the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. You can select your interpreting language in the globe icon. All the participants, please select your preferred language as well at the bottom right corner of your screen. In every chapter, the conversation between artists and our chief curator in MOLAA focuses in a series or specific work of art that requires a detailed inspection and a deliberate process of contemplation and exploration. We go deep in the ideas surrounding the creation of the works, their research sources and inspiration in an effort to dwell in the world of the artist. In this chapter of MOLAA Zoom Project, we interview the renowned artist Francesco Mariotti, along with Dr. Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who is a collaborator in this exhibit. Francesco Mariotti was born in 1943 in Bern, Switzerland, and emigrated with his family to Peru in 1953. He was there for his schooling in elementary and middle school until 1961. After his science high school, he studied in Paris and Hamburg, the art. In 1967, he integrated the group Cruising in Hamburg. In 1969, he presented in 4 documenta of Kassel, the Luminous Cube. In 1971, he went back to Lima, where he organized the art festivals Contacta 71 and Contacta 72. After that, he worked in Cusco since 1972 and until 1975 for SINAMUS, the National System of Support for Social Mobilization, as the chief of cultural matters, where he organized the Hatari Art Festival and Inkari Art Festival. He was a teacher, guest professor at the School of Fine Arts in Lima and a member of the collective EPS Huayco. Between 1981 and 1983, he was the director of the print atelier of Galeria Flaviana in Locarno, Switzerland, until 1987, and he was a collaborator of the Video Art Festival of Locarno and General Secretary of AVAC. He has worked with the concept of recycling as a medium for art, and he has developed his projects around the idea of hybrid and the relationships between art, technology, and nature. Among the works more famous in the past few years are Die Luciferin, the Farm of the Fireflies, La Frontera de las Luciérnagas, Los Jardines Híbridos, Quantum Flower Ballet, and Tomato. Since 2017, his work is focused on the Project Fireflies Memorial, dedicated to the protectors of the environment. Currently, he works and lives both in Switzerland and Peru. If you're just logging on, we have interpreting available. Every participant, please select your preferred language on the bottom right corner of the screen in the icon of interpretation, because the conversation will happen in Spanish. And now I will allow Gabriela to start our conversation. She's the chief curator. Thank you, Solimar, for that introduction. And thank you to all the team in MOLAA. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us in this wonderful panel that we have here today alongside our very dear Francesco Mariotti and Jose Carlos Mariátegui. It's a huge pleasure to be able to present and talk a little bit more about Arteônica, the art project that MOLAA is developing as part of the program of Getty Pacific Standard Time for 2024. As a chief curator and director of this MOLAA project, it's a great pleasure for me to speak briefly about Arteônica, art, science, and technology in Latin America today. It's a research project and also the next exhibit that we will open in September of 2024, and that counts with the support and the creation of more than 20 artists from Mexico, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, and with a wonderful committee alongside with Jose Carlos Mariátegui, Tania Aedo, Rodrigo Alonso, and Patrick Frank. First, I'd like to say that Arteônica takes its name from the pioneering artist of electronic art, Valdemar Cordeiro from Brazil, who was one of the first computer artists of his area. And this is a verbal synthesis of the electronic art, and it also the original title of the exhibit that he had in Brazil in 1971. He finds the computer as an instrument or a tool for positive social change that can democratize art and culture. That is why, continuing with this series of talks that we started at the beginning of the year and reflecting around Arteônica, it's a great pleasure for me to talk to you all and to talk to Francesco and Jose Carlos. Thank you. So, Francesco, I would like to start from the beginning so that later on, alongside with Jose Carlos, we can start analyzing and reflecting on a first selection that we did for this talk around your body of work, your great contribution, not only to Latin American art, but also in the international scene. So how does this relationship between art and technology happen? I would like you to tell us how you started to build this creative vision that links those two worlds that are so important to you and in your work. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Solimar. Thank you, Jose Carlos. Thank you, Solimar, for the introduction, and Jose Carlos that proposed to me and proposed me as a participant in this very important show here called Arteônica. Since I was little, I have been a very manual person. I really liked that kind of work. And at some point in my life, I thought I could be an artist or a painter. And that's how I approached the world of art, through paint. As a painter, I don't think I achieved much, but the interesting thing is that through painting, I started looking at the problem of light, at the issue of light. And I was always lacking some luminosity when I tried painting. I tried using neon colors and things like that until I started to introduce in my paintings and in objects light, electrical light, artificial light. That on one side, that's how I really didn't have any trouble using electrical systems, because like I said, I've always been a bricklayer. And when I was in the fine art school, the professor that was very important for me, John Foss, when we were doing the visits when he was visiting the atelier where we worked, I would show him my work. But he actually was looking at things that I would put together, and those other creations were more interesting for him than my painting. And I thought, well, it was odd that he was more interested in all these DIY projects that I had instead of my paintings. So this key moment, I like to tell the story about it because it's important. I had the possibility of going to New York, and he was a very good friends with Cristo, the sculptor. He gave me his address, and I visited Cristo at his atelier in New York, and I showed him some pictures of what I was doing. And he told me this was around 1965, 1966, 67. And he told me, well, yeah, this is pretty nice what you're doing, it's cool. But he said art is not an individual issue, it's not about your personal problems, for example. Those are not very important for art. And to me, that was kind of like a brainwashing. I remember that I left his workshop feeling almost kind of dizzy, and I went back to Hamburg, and chance wanted me. And in 1960, yes, by chance, in the school, he went to the school there. He saw some of the works that Klaus Gellmacher started creating, because he and I were working in some conjoint projects with sound and light, and we were invited to do a project for Documenta in Kassel. Lately, or recently, this very interesting little book from Mela Davila has been, present, where she explains all that part about Documenta and how our project of that luminous cube and all the multiple ones that we created since then, how they have been an example so that Documenta can develop a self-financing project through Documenta financing. So that's when I make the jump to technology. From being a painter, as you can see, I've become some kind of a builder, or, electrician or mechanical builder. I always say that I've replaced the brush with a soldering tool and a screwdriver eventually. And what happens after the invitation to the Bienal of Sao Paulo. I don't know if, Jose Carlos, you would like to say something about Documenta before we move on to the next step, to the sculpture of the luminous sphere. I want to add a couple of things. I think that for you, and you may be able to tell us as well, the project maybe in the image, you cannot really see it very well, but that was a project that even for today is incredible. You used 9,000 light bulbs, 1,000 fluorescent lamps, a fan that looks like it was from an airplane. It was an installation that wasn't far from like a work from Cristo, who you met there as well once more. So I think this was not a permanent work. Almost all of the pieces were on loan. They were like industrial pieces on loan. So tell us a little bit more about that. What was the goal of the project? One of the things that we usually mention is, for you, that piece was not just an installation with a series of multi-sensory elements. It was also a space for discussion. So how did you see it back then? And how was it also a critique to the Documenta itself? Well, yeah, that there were a lot of different aspects. That's true. One important aspect was that it was a piece conceived as, being able to be assembled and disassembled. It was not a sculpture as you normally conceive as a sculpture, to leave it somewhere there forever, or however long the material can last for. The material, a large part of the material was assembled, and the idea of the cube was that it was a place of encounter and especially of discussion. 1968 was a very interesting moment, politically speaking, and the sculpture had some microphones and speakers. And in the four corners, and people could talk. The sculpture was a talking sculpture, and a series of different sounds would come together. We also got together with a series of young North American musicians that didn't want to go to the Vietnam War, and they had done some presentations, and then they asked if they could play their hard rock that they were playing back then. And so they were doing some concerts in the Cube also. The other interesting thing is that when Documenta was open, we hadn't finished the piece. In this image, you can see it once it was finished, but really you could only see the structure of these prefabricated angles. And in a certain way, we also made a manifest in which, in part, we discussed and talked about Documenta. It's a manifest that I can't show you right now, but at that time it was very important because we were questioning Documenta, that it was an exhibit financed with public money, and that it had to be very open and popular and open to all kinds of audience, not just a group of specialists. And at the same time, we were talking about or justifying the fact that the piece wasn't finished, saying that it was a bit absurd to present finished works in an exhibit where the public can only admire them. And we said that actually it would be best if the public could participate, like having people look at the work in progress without us knowing actually that term. We proposed that as a strategy of the exhibit as well. And so the fan that you can see right there at the end, which is quite impressive, is the fan of a charcoal mine that was lent to us by a company. I don't want to go in too deep because I don't want to take up a lot of the time. But from there, you went on to do another work of a different dimension for the Bienal in San Pablo, because it was a very particular Bienal the following year. Yes. With the Documenta project, I learned, and I think right now it would be a bit more complicated, but back then, with Klaus Gertmacher, we did the model, the project that was accepted by Documenta, and then we traveled all over Germany. We visited different industries to ask if they could lend us materials. And the following year, in 1969, the Swiss government proposed me as a participant of the Bienal in Sao Paulo. And so I had the idea of this luminous sphere, and I repeated practically the same practice. I approached the industries because even if I didn't have a budget, of course, it was a relatively small budget. And I was young, I was 24, 25 years old. So I approached different industries that would very openly receive me, and I was able to find the materials and the technological support to be able to create this sphere. It weighed about 40 tons. Pancho, back then you were influenced quite a bit by the transcendental Hindu ideology, and you were interested in exploring aspects beyond the installation itself. So how some of these multi-sensory aspects could be communicated through your work as well. So I think that's what's interesting in this piece. It has some impressive characteristics. It's created by 250 triangles. It doesn't have a sound system or a frequencies. It creates some kind of an olfactory system that now even today sounds like a very innovative thing. It had different temperatures, so it's an experience that it's very difficult to translate in the image we have right here. But I think one of the goals of this piece that I think was in Art Basel 70, which was the first one, and then it was in Lima, was to create a piece of art that was a collective experience, right? Yes, what happens? Well, the year, 69, 68, 69, there was the whole political movement, and it was also a mystical and spiritual movement. It was the moment of, the drugs, especially LSD. It was a moment where generations like mine were learning and started having contact with the Eastern cultures, exactly, with all these kind of like philosophy from India or the Hindu philosophy. So I was in that kind of wave. And back then there was a very severe conflict also in the different groups of communities that lived as students between the political decisions and the decisions of a spiritual nature, because politics were getting more radicalized to becoming violent and armed movements. And on the other hand, we had the pacifist movement that was also related to the war in Vietnam and all of that. So I approached, because I also started studying Sanskrit at that time. I started approaching the world of yoga and meditation. So right after Documenta, I was pretty saturated from art, and I had withdrawn from it. And so when I get this invitation, I thought that it was sort of logical to make a sculpture to meditate, and where you could perceive sensations, very deep sensations that you can't really see it on the picture, but at the top of that nucleus that you can see that central element, there's a source of water, and there's a flame, a fire flame. And it was the circular movement of light, and this is a book. That's a book. I don't have it right now at hand, but I was very, very inspired in the Eastern philosophies. And from there, you go to Lima, and you were invited to be a part of a show, but you decided to organize a whole festival, art festival. And right now here we have an image of an experience that I think is also important to your later work, and that is linked to the previous one. And those are the illustrations that you created for the book by Cesar Calvo, The Three Halves of Inomoxo. But taking into consideration that we have a limited time, can we let's focus a little bit on how you had been raised in Peru, you had been in Europe, you had been living there, and then you go back to Peru and you have all these new experiences as well with the cultures from the Andes and the Amazon. And I think that took you to a different space of discussion and reflection in terms of your work, right? Yes, I was very influenced naturally by the theories of Bauhaus. And in this book of Mela Davila, she remembers Bode, who was the founder of Documenta. And she's talking about this idea of the total piece of work. Bode back then had conceived Documenta as a total work of art, which was not just an exhibit of plastic arts, but also other kinds of disciplines like dance and theater, and those were some ideas in the air by that time. So by the time I arrive in Peru and get this invitation by Alfonso Castrillon, he was the director of the Contemporary Institute of Art in Lima, to do this exhibit. I mentioned to him that I didn't really see a lot of sense in making this individual show, so I proposed that we did some kind of a total art festival. Or actually, I proposed the idea of a mixed media, because in Hamburg, we had used Kunsthalle among many of the young artists, and we had used that. There was an artist that occupies this certain space, and we had been working day and night for about a week. So I had this idea about contacting Peruvian artists and inviting them to have a very similar experience in the Institute of Contemporary Art. It was a really, really beautiful space. So Alfonso Castrillon gave me a list of artists whom I visited. And of course, I was completely out of, my element. The Peruvian artists at the time did, embrace me with certain respect, but they said no, they didn't want to participate in an experience like that. So that's where I meet Lucho Arias Vera, who's a Peruvian artist. And we started wondering, well, what should we do? And we did like a summons, an open call to different artists of different genres to participate in this collective experience. And that's where we had this exhibit called Contacta, which was a great success at the time, and where there was a lot of artists participation, poets, popular artists, painters, academics. And it was such a positive experience that at the following year, in 1972, we did it not in a museum, but in a public park. And those were impressive experiences that inspired the government later on at that time to take back that idea. And like Solimar said in her introduction, then I went to Cusco and we organized different festivals, regional festivals. And in the end, we had 2 different editions of the festival at a whole national level with artists from the different provinces and departments in Peru. The artists got together in Lima to have this great show of different kinds of art. Of course, art from the Amazon, the Andes. We had poetry, painting, arts and crafts, music. So it was a total art festival. But back then, that's when you meet Cesar Calvo. Yes, he had a group, a cultural group called Javierero in homage to the poet that had died, and he had participated in the guerrillas that entered through Bolivia and Puerto Maldonado. And that's where I met Cesar Calvo. And later on, Cesar Calvo published the book, The Three Halves, and that's where he asked me to create these illustrations. And one of those creations, who by the way, that book is translated into English. And that's where this creation Chuyachaki appears. And Chuyachaki is a kind of character, some kind of leprechaun or this mythical figure or goblin that resembles a human being, and that is feared by people in the jungle to a certain extent. But at the same time, they like this character because Chuyachaki attacks you, but he attacks you because he wants to be your friend. So there are very interesting aspects to this character, in a sense that it's an artificial figure. And that's why when I start this project with the poetry and the project of AI, I gave it the title of Chuyachaki. Well, and that's interesting because then you go back to Locarno, to Switzerland at the beginning of the 80s, and you find this movement of art and technology and the video festival in Locarno, which was a very important festival where you participated very actively, and they started talking about AI back then. So I think you felt related to this character that you like, but at the same time you're afraid of it. That's what happens today with AI, and it's fascinating. And to a certain extent, you relate that to algorithms that are, forming the way we learn and our attention. And nowadays, all of these extrasensory impulses have become binary code. So I think it's a little bit about how you transformed these mystical ideas and these stories of the Amazon into works of art in this new DIY that you create starting in the 80s. Yes, now it's true. And like it was said, I did grow up in Peru, and as a child, I would frequent the jungle, and that's a magical world that definitely had an influence, and I am well aware of that all the time. In the colloquiums of Mount Verita, where there were some wonderful characters like Enrico Fulquiñón and Victorio Fagone, Danny Block. That was the first time where I heard them talk about artificial intelligence. And that's when I was working on the illustrations of that book. In this piece that you see right there, the small panels are solar panels. Those were the first solar panels that you could find in the market. back then it was the first, the era of the first important space travel. And these are the solar panels that were available. And I thought it was amazing that from a solid substance, you could create energy. So I was looking at how I could represent that in this work of art. And of course, they produced very little energy, these small panels. And so they're feeding a small digital clock, those, those early digital watches. So in that small clock, there is an intelligence, because I thought, well, if the world disappears, this small sculpture will continue to live as long as there is light, and the intelligence in there will survive. And that's the mental game, that I have, and that's why I call that sculpture Chuyachaki Artificial Intelligence, which at the same time is also a bit of a homage to Yves Klein, because of the blue sponge, and the sponge sort of resembles a brain as well. Now, the way we're moving on to La Rana, or the frog, I think also the important part is that Chuyachaki can be a software. We've been talking about solar panels. You work a lot with LEDs, but also with computers. And then you poured your idea of Chuyachaki in this software in collaboration with Manuel Rodriguez, with whom you've been working in all these collaborations. And normally these sculptures were assembled with, materials that were on loan, and then they had to be disassembled. But these different technological components that we have seen from your experience in Locarno, but then that you also have all these other things that belong to your Amazonian experience and that are zoomorph. Yes, that expression comes from Vittorio Fagon. And I wanted to say, eventually it can be interesting for whoever is listening. I have almost always financed my projects by creating multiples related to a project. And I had forgotten, but even the smell, I include smell a lot of the time in my works, in my pieces. In the year 65, I had created some paintings that emit a smell. Some of them, one of them was a field of violets and another one of roses. And when the audience gets close, they would produce, the smell of violets or roses. Actually, the violet ones was very successful in Paris, in one of the salons. And well, it's going back. Lately, I don't really use the human being as a topic very much, as an object of my work. Most of the time it's been animals or insects or plants. And La Rana, the frog, is one of the important characters. Rana and Papagayo, there are these works that are, there's a poem that's a poem for a frog and other animals and the monkey. But when I created the first one, I had the first parrot, and I wanted it to be able to talk. And back then there were the first games for children where you could maybe press, let's say, the shape of a car, and it would go beep beep. or if you press the frog, you know, it would make the sound and things like that. So that's when I met Manolo Rodriguez, who used to live here in Lugano. And I talked to him about it, and he said, well, there are these computers that can talk, that you can create some voice programs with. The voice, it was that computer, Commodore 64, and I know some kids, some young kids that were between 12 and 13, and they know how these things work. So I visited those kids. I remember we were sitting there at their parents' dining room, and they had their computers, and of course they knew perfectly well, just like kids today that can, you know, use a series of devices with such ease, and they understood perfectly how you could activate these programs, and actually they knew how to do basic programming and things like that. So I explained my issue to them. They said no problem. They created a program where I could write the texts and the computer would speak them out loud. The computer only spoke English, so it's a lot of fun, because I would write in Italian or in Spanish or in German, and to have the computer pronounce a word and have it sound more or less like Spanish, you can, you know, if you wrote te amo in Spanish, the computer would have said te amo maybe with that English pronunciation. So it's a lot of fun to see how in those poems are supposedly written in a language, you know, alphabetically, that is intelligible, but then the sound in the end was correct. And I think we also have that other sculpture. I think we can also maybe open up for questions from the audience while you present different other works. Right now we have Gaia. Well, we had Rana, which is the one we're looking at. After that, we have Gaia, the return of the fireflies. Rana is interesting because that was the first one, and that's the one that speaks out the text, which is something that's fundamental. That's the work, that's a piece that will be at Arteônica. And it questions, because it says words are hablo, or I talk, or parlo in Italian. Then, or therefore, I am smart. That's the fact. The fact that I talk means that I am smart. But at the same time, it asks itself, am I smart? Do I talk? It could be an affirmation, but it can also be a question. And with a random system, the poetry kind of renovates itself and is composed differently. And at the same time, it's printed by a printer, and then the audience could take, you know, a piece, half a meter, 20 centimeters of poetry. And I think with the discussion we have right now about artificial intelligence and all of that, this text is key. I mean, I myself, I'm surprised of how good it is. That's why I think it's really great, and I am so proud and so happy that this piece can go over there to MOLAA. Well, it's a pleasure for us, actually, Francesco. It's a pleasure to listen to you both with so much knowledge and experience and generosity of wanting to share with all of us this wonderful journey that we're going to have the luxury of having you here in MOLAA, and that we will all be able to enjoy and learn and find out a lot more about all your creations. So if you agree, Francesco and Jose Carlos, we can now open it up for questions from the audience that is with us today, and Solimar will be able to start reading the questions. Thank you, everyone, for sharing today with us. It has been wonderful to hear the evolution of your work and how it has been impactful. We have one question from Paulina Pardo. And she says, good morning. If possible, I would like to ask the artist if he can tell us a little bit more about his experience of showing a piece of work that's electronic and participative within the political context of the boycott of the Bienal in Sao Paulo that a lot of artists did. So how is your experience working with the organizers of the Bienal, and how was the work of art received by other artists and the audience in Sao Paulo? Well, that was a very interesting question, an important question. In 1969, like I mentioned, I had withdrawn after Documenta from the world of art. And I had dedicated myself to studying Sanskrit more than anything. And when I got the invitation to participate in the Bienal in Sao Paulo, I didn't know about the political problem in Brazil. And I didn't know either that some countries had decided not to participate in the Bienal as a protest. So what I learned afterwards, I mean, nowadays we know so much that it's not as scandalous, but back then it was pretty heavy for me, because when I arrived in Sao Paulo later on with the piece, I found out that Switzerland had decided to participate in the Biennale with some conditions, because Brazil had pressured, to a certain extent, had pressured Switzerland through the exports of coffee and cocoa in case they didn't participate in the show. Then things got a little bit more complicated later on, but I don't think that this is the time to tell you everything that's happened. The point is that I was already in Brazil, and the piece was already there, and it was shown. And I don't think it was very successful. It was relatively successful. First, it was shown in the space, I don't remember right now the name of the area, when it was a piece that had to be outdoors, but because of safety reasons, it was placed indoors. And I realized that during the show that the audience was, lining up outside to be able to be there for like 15 minutes within this experience of smell and temperatures and sound. So there was a commitment from the Bienal to the Swiss government to give an award to the Swiss. The work was not did not get an award. The award was given to another work, and the artist Baminier, that had shown his work that year at the Biennale, and he was a professor in Hamburg, and who knew me, he protested. I remember it was a whole speech. And anyway, as technological work, maybe it didn't really fit the Biennale. There was some criticism, some very interesting criticism. Maybe Jose Carlos can remember the name. Well, what I remember, just to add to what he's saying, I remember that in the press and in the archive, one of the works that is repeated the most is something called the Hindu temple. That's what they called that piece. And the piece was at the entrance, so it had a very good place. And in Sao Paulo, they were talking about the first day of the Bienal, and I think they had about 5,000 people. And the first photo was the image of the flame of this Hindu temple, which is what they were calling it. Well, it's interesting. I didn't know that about Hindu temple. Later on, when it came back to Switzerland and it was shown at the first Basel, there was a book or a catalog about the story, and I think it shows, I think in the first page they show the sculpture, and it says hippie temple, but without the author. It's like, you know, it grew from nothing. So in Lima, they used to call it the ball, I think. A bit closer. And then in Argentina, probably they would have called it a football ball, you know, because football is so popular there. We have another question from Crystal. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I am very impacted by Chiyachaki, artificial intelligence from 1984. Especially, I am impacted by your statement on how the solar panels will remain to be alive and maintain its intelligence in the event of the world no longer existing. My question is, what are your thoughts about the relevance of this particular work today within the context of the climate crisis that is happening globally, including the advancement and availability of solar panels? Well, thank you for your question. It allows me the opportunity to talk about what I've been doing in the past few years. Through light and solar panels, I've come close to light, but to the kind of light that you see at night, and that is how I discovered fireflies. So I started creating all these different works of sculptures with titles of fireflies. And I met a biologist that was interested in my work. And I've learned more and more about the world of the fireflies, about bioluminescence, and what fireflies mean today as a metaphor, basically, where there are fireflies, there's an intact environment and habitat, because it means there's no pollution of chemistry, no light pollution, water's clean, there's food readily available for their larvae. So these works that I've been creating in open spaces, these are projects of renaturalization. I produce energy with solar panels, and at night you can appreciate this play, this luminous spectacle. But the main goal is to renaturalize a polluted space. And after 6 years, I've made certain experiments of that kind. I no longer do the show or the solar panels. It's the fireflies themselves that create the show. That's why I call it the nuptial dance of the fireflies. And so, yeah, I've come a lot closer to biology, and my projects are now farther from technology. I no longer work with computers. I'm now closer to nature than before. Thank you very much. This concludes our question and answer section. Gabriela, would you like to close us up? Well, I just want to say thank you to you both. Being able to go more in depth in your work, Francesco fills us with knowledge, with questions also, which I think is the most important part of this talks. All the questions that can be generated because of art and through the power of art. And thank you, Francesco, for your creation, for your generosity. Jose Carlos, thanks a million for all the support that you are giving to Arteônica. And we will continue, we'll keep on working. We'll see you soon, and we hope to see you all in September for our great opening of Arteônica, Art, Science, and Technology in Latin America today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry, please just allow me to say a special thank you, because a moment like this allows me to come close a little bit with the world of art, with which I have a bit of a complicated relationship. But moments like this, I think it's justified to continue to believe in art and culture, and that to believe that they can help and create something in society. It's a pleasure for us. Thank you to Dr. Mariottegui. Thank you for sharing with us today. And thank you to all the participants in this past hour. Thank you to our interpreter. We will see you in our next project. We're gonna make a pause from talking about Arteônica, because we will talk to you about our project in Venice, and Gabriela will interview our artist in her gallery and the exhibit that she will have in Venice as part of some of the collaborations that we will have from the 60th International Exhibit of the Biennale of Venice, where we will participate as a museum, MOLAA, alongside our main partners of this project, Michelle Edash, William Edash, and Santiago Garcia Galvan. We hope to see you in our next edition of MOLAA Zoom Project, and then we will resume the series of Arteônica in May. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.